Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Dr. Finchen. And thank you very much for those who are present of spending their time with me. Anyway, I get basically to the point what I want to do, because it's a complicated issue here, because the official topic is in search of Whitehead's deity. I should add, I specifically used the term deity because I did not want to use the term God, because deity is much more of a neutral term. It's more usable in an application to Whitehead. You will see why. Because it lends itself much more to a possibility of interpretation. And it's not fixated on any kind of specific kind of concept of God or heaven. Quickly, I should say the following. This is not just my talk and all this. Of course, I'm pleased to do this. After all, that's what I spent my time on. And it's also, this is supposed to be an exercise in scholarship, research, and all this. And I should remind some people, despite the internet and everything else, remember this book was written and researched 5 years without internet, without anything. As I told my colleague here, I was a young guy, very idealistic. I'm still a little bit, but a little bit less, but still, out of my own pocket, I visited many of the so-called first generation Whitehead scholars. I mean, they didn't know who I was. Traveled to England here and there, and to invite them actually to Bonn. At that time, I was a young assistant in Bonn University, the alma mater of Nietzsche and Marx, after all. Anyway, I mean, I did a very idealistic effort of getting to speak, and in fact, it did come so that in 1981, we had the first International Whitehead Conference in Bonn, which I organized. And you wouldn't believe this, it was a single idea I had. I was walking the marketplace of Bonn in front of the Beethoven statue and the post office building with the famous balcony where Queen Victoria and her German husband Albert visited one time. And exactly there, I suddenly had this idea: why don't you invite the people that you know? And that actually worked. I was a bit lucky. Of course, in this kind of you need support. They were very generous with money in those days, and whatever. And they actually came. And as Dr. Fischer said, yes, in Germany nobody knew Whitehead as a philosopher. They all knew Whitehead as a mathematician, the author of Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell. But many people believed that was Russell, he was the main author, which is of course not the case. Russell was a little bit a guy, aristocrat, who thought, well, who is Whitehead? Whitehead was laid back a little bit, typical Victorian middle class character, modest in many ways, but he needed time and all this. But it was actually Whitehead who discovered Russell in Cambridge, Trinity College, Cambridge. This is, of course, also the college of Newton, and then later Keynes or Wittgenstein and what have you. That's also important, this college, say, for certain philosophical developments, what have you. Certainly, in terms of Whitehead, I should add, because I'm a believer in biography and also believe in the big picture sometimes. Meaning in details, you can always spend in details, but the big picture is Whitehead. One of the reasons why Whitehead was not as successful as, say, some of these so-called analytical philosophy people whom I all met personally, whatever, was because Whitehead was in a very unfortunate generation, including other two ones who are famous: Samuel Alexander, who came from Australia, was in Manchester, Space, Time and God, big book, 2 volumes, also very interesting. And then the other guy who's really my favorite, aside from Whitehead, is R.J. Collingwood. Collingwood was a historian, archaeologist, and really a very, very interesting character who unfortunately, they belong to a generation, their pupils, meaning their students there, they all died in the First World War. That was a problem. So there was a gap. And I suggest, but I think I'm not totally wrong, one of the reasons why analytical philosophy then took off at a particular time was very simply, there was a big gap between that generation, Whitehead, Alexander, and Collingwood, and their students dying in the war and all this, and then there was nothing in betweenish. So the analytical people like Gilbert Blythe, the concept of mind and so forth, they were the succeeding generation, but still relatively young. So they sort of moved into this vacuum. That is my interpretation. I would like to think I'm not totally wrong, but this is an issue of sociology, maybe not a philosophy. Anyway, I would suggest the following too. For those of you who want to put Whitehead into the big picture, that is a very nice reference in terms of who Whitehead was and all that, would be the autobiography, by Gerkenstein, the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. Stein, who was in Paris, Picasso, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, all these people. She wrote this book, and in chapter 6, it actually says war. She meant the First World War. You have a whole chapter, about 10 pages on it, about Whitehead and his wife. Meaning Gerkenstein apparently was very good friends with them and visited them in England very often. And she says, one of the very, very few people she met, Stein, about Whitehead, he was a genius. Actually, that's exactly what she said, she was a genius. And I would like to think that's probably true. I had a very good teacher, Thelma Levine. She unfortunately died a couple of years ago, 96. She knew Whitehead personally too at Harvard University, and she also pointed out to me he had a very curious sense of intuition, very powerful ways. And one should add too, you see, Whitehead was a mathematician most of his life, professor of mathematics. First in Cambridge, then in London. But then his heart was really into philosophy, so he never had this opportunity. Suddenly, by chance, I don't want to go into all the details, with 63 years of age, no, he did not retire. Harvard University invited him for a professorship of philosophy. And he said in his dialogues, memoirs, he said, one of the happiest days of my life, somebody invited me to teach philosophy. And this is exactly what he did, and for the next 20 years. And of course, at Harvard, he had an enormous impact at that time. And so, so Whitehead was always known as a mathematician, but then I would say the following, rightfully so. If you would want to name two philosophy books of the 20th century where you could say they will survive the 21st century, maybe the second century, and that are two books, that is Heidegger's Sein und Zeit, Being in Time, and Whitehead's Process and Reality. I would say the following, because most of you are a little bit familiar with Heidegger more so. I would say the following. Heidegger is more of the professional philosopher. He's more systematic. He knows his history of philosophy. He's more compressive. But Whitehead is more speculative, has massive, highly interesting intuitions. And he's not a professional philosopher, I found this out, which is okay, but he had a very keen sense of intuition. He knew exactly what to look for. When you read a text sometimes, and there are people who immediately see, oh, that's it, and they don't read the whole thing. There are people like that. Whitehead belonged to that kind of type of thinker. He immediately understood the significance of certain texts and all this. I will lay out in detail a little bit later on why I happen to know this, because I checked all of his footnotes. That's why some people may be a little bit afraid of me for one reason or another, because I actually do check footnotes and read them. Footnotes are important, and not because of the footnote, but because it's an evidence that you actually work with this stuff. And despite the internet age and all that, since this is a seminar in terms of scholarship, what have you, and it's very important that one keeps a certain integrity in scholarship, because scholarship, serious scholarship, you know this and I do, takes time. You cannot just do this in 5 minutes, or maybe in a week, or go to some conference and everything is wonderful. Really serious scholarship takes a lot of time sometimes. You have to be able to be by yourself a long time sometimes. No interference, no internet, no mobile phones, and all that. I mean, these are just facts of life. And if anybody would want to argue against me, I would say you're wrong. Yes, the internet makes things easier, to get certain facts that you want to know about, right? But it doesn't substitute serious reading and contemplating and looking at the text from a professional point of view. That takes time. And if you spend too much time with activism, what have you, you will not make it. As simple as that. Because the true sense of like when you teach and all that comes out of your research if you take it serious. Very clear. That's a lesson I have to say that I learned in Bonn in Germany with my so-called habilitation, because the German system still follows a little bit to some extent, the dictum that a good scholar also makes a good teacher, which is not necessary, but the fact is scholarship in whatever you do promotes, keeps you going. And I'm not talking about being up to date, what's this fashionable or not fashionable. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about being ready to pursue a certain goal. What do I want to find out exactly? Does that make sense? A, B, C, and D, and so forth. And this, of course, is a space of luxury too. See, people forget this. When people go into philosophy to take a great risk, a lot of people are not aware of this. As you know, we're not living in the age where Finance Minister Necker of the Judicators would finance your studies and all this. There's having competition internationally now, and philosophy is not exactly what people are crazy about, in terms of supply and demand. So there are risks, but I'm still insisting, and I have to say this for all of us, that if you do studies and you aim at a certain kind of goal, and you know exactly what you want and all this, leave it open-ended, because you never know. Because if you think you know the answer, why do research in the first place? There's always a risk involved to find out, well, it's too bad. I thought I had something, but the rabbit escaped. You know what I mean? So there's always this risk. But it's also, I would say, a certain, how should I say, a therapy in this, in the sense that there are moments that makes you happy. People never talk about this. They think, oh, when somebody does research and this and that, this has to be some boring affair and this and that and so forth. This is not necessarily true. Sometimes you discover things, suddenly that makes you happy, and you even dance, which I did sometimes, alone. But anyway, when I discovered a few things here, which I tell you about, or just recently, quickly, since we are here in the seminar for research and all that, right now I'm working on Oswald Spengler. Spengler, 100 years anniversary. The Koreans, Chinese are very interested in him for obvious reasons, because Spengler is not Eurocentric. Edward Said forgot about him. Spengler has had a highly interesting impact and influence, even in England particularly in all this, and now he's being reissued, rediscovered. And then happiness, by chance, since I'm working on this now, I discovered that F. Scott Fitzgerald, the American writer, was a big fan of Spengler and actually read this guy when he wrote The Great Gatsby. There is even an MA written in North Carolina somewhere who shows very clearly what impact Spengler had on F. Scott Fitzgerald. That makes you happy in a way. Oh, yes, it's very interesting. Now, it doesn't have to be happiness for everybody, but these are these little, how should I say, moments where you say, hey, this is interesting. F. Scott Fitzgerald and Oswald Spengler. although there are letters marked Perkins. The movie, a recent movie they had on Perkins, Scribner editor, where they had a letter for the exchange where they discussed Spengler, and all drunk with Spengler. Of course, his problem was alcohol problem, so there was a pun about himself. Anyway, enough of footnotes and entertainment. Let's get a little bit more. We need this way, human beings. Because as I always say to my students, it would be horribly boring if I would be total philosophy for 1 hour and they all go to sleep. Okay, now we have this issue, and that is Process and Reality is really a great book. It's right here. This is Process and Reality. Notes all over the place. It's very interesting thing. But Process and Reality is, you could say, the following. Follows a certain mathematical scheme, definitions and then application a little bit. The mathematician Whitehead is still involved here, but then he becomes speculative. And in that sense, I would say this book is probably the greatest book in the 20th century when it comes to speculative thinking. Speculative thinking doesn't mean crazy stuff and anything like that. It means serious speculation about possibilities. What could be nowadays. Taking big risks to make himself, how should I say, a little bit untenable, but, as I said, highly interesting results. And also much of the Process and Reality are fragmentary. You can see that. When he follows in the beginning, when he follows, it's more systematic, more mathematical in the approach. The more he becomes philosophical or metaphysical, he becomes more fragmented. That has an advantage, by the way. That is sometimes, it's a big torso, metaphysical torso, as I would call them. This book actually, meaning much of it is not basically filled out. He has some crazy idea here and there. I mean, good, positive, crazy ideas. He writes it down quickly and all this. By the way, it was the basis of his lecture, the famous lectures in Edinburgh that are usually given every year. I would give it lectures delivered at University of Edinburgh, 1927-28. Heidegger's Silent Side was published in 1927. Unfortunately, never met. Imagine discussion Heidegger and Whitehead. That would have been. Oh, there was Heidegger and Ernst Cassirer, of course. But I could have much more imagined Ernst Cassirer and Whitehead. That would have been a little bit more gentlemanly-like. So it's better this way. Whatever. Now, what is the issue here? The issue here is what I try to do here is I want to show you that if you do thorough, what you might call a history of philosophy, this is not some conglomerate or some stupid little stories of what A and B said. If you do it seriously, systematically, you can get something out of this. Now, of course, you have to apply it in a relevant manner. So I've noticed very clearly that in Whitehead, at the end, maybe only 15 pages on that, he deals with a very curious God, which he calls what you might call with a bipolar nature, very curious matters, right? 1 second before we get to the very abstruse, I'm not joking, but if you follow through that I did 5 years ago, that makes all sense in a kind of way. And you know, as things are, sometimes commentators understand better what you were doing than doing yourself. Because see, people always think, well, after all, I was there, I should know better. But that is the reason why we need biographers. The very dangerous is to write memoirs and autobiography, which I actually did. I started with Egypt. I continue after 300 pages, but I came to the conclusion when I did this, that it's not as easy as you think. I had to start 3 times to catch myself lying all the time. I put myself in a favorable light. So that took some time therapy to do that, but it's not as easy as you think. People think, oh, of course, I know myself. This is why we need biography. This is why we need commentators who comment about your work. I'm not talking about objectivity necessarily, but it's very clear that sometimes you yourself, although Whitehead, it doesn't make any difference, did not always understand the insights he himself had. See, and it sounds a little bit abstruse, but I think I'm not totally wrong. But sometimes you have strange ideas. I mean, really, usually you go for a walk or you dream and all this, and it's fantastic and all this, but you don't understand what is going on with you, but you got it there, right? And then very often it takes 20 years later till somebody, the next generation, usually sees much better what the previous generation actually did. That's one of those curiosities of life, as Kierkegaard said, we must live life forward, not backward. Now, the problem here in Whitehead is the following. In terms of, you could say, his conception of deity becomes very complex. I try to break it down a little bit. And that is, I have noticed very clearly that his conception of deity is not typical so-called Christian. It's not a typical kind of a conception I use now as an example, a God concept that we're used to. I mean, if you are familiar, of course, with the Semitic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, then very clear, of course, Whitehead's brother was a bishop in Madras, after all. So he had a little bit of connections to the religious establishment, a little bit, however, very well educated. But I think Whitehead was much more, how should I put this, radical in his thinking than many people assume. He didn't make big announcements, he didn't make big speeches, no revolutionary rhetoric and anything like that. He did this quietly, and it seems to me he took some time to work this out. And so I would say the following. Aside this, of course, there are other categories which are also important that play into the game. Right now, I just give you quickly the rundown in terms of the historical situation, who is important, what for his conception at the end. And then, of course, I have to go back a little bit to make clear to you from a systematic point of view why this development is so important for us today. So the following. When you read him very carefully, and of course I did, what I first did is in terms of scholarship, I made a list of all the stuff that he actually read. And I particularly like John Locke, David Hume, of course, what edition of Kant did he use, what translation, all of that, 5 years gives you some time. And I make a list, and I made a list very clearly of the quotations he did, meaning what exactly I want to find out, did he actually read? So of course it takes time, you have to find which edition did he use and so forth. So that was a little bit much work, but it was worth it. And so I, as an example, I reread John Locke totally again, his essay, and that, beautiful English and all this, but still at nights hard work, But it was worth it, because when you read the whole work, you suddenly realize what did Whitehead see in Locke, or what did Whitehead see in Berkeley in all this. I mean, this is labor, loves labor, you could say, But then suddenly you notice, what is this? What is his relationship to Plato, for instance? What did he read in Plato? What did he get out of Plato? And then, as life, as things are, I had the opportunity in George Washington at the time when it was an undergraduate Smithsonian institution. There were some people who are relatively well known, unfortunately I forget the name now, history of science. There was a relatively new subject matter. The first PhD history of science was given in Harvard in 1947. I mean, so history of science, and here we're talking about late 60s, 70s. So we're talking about a relatively new discipline, And of course, in the 1950s, with positivism going on, of course, the idea is history could not have possibly science because these are facts. and facts are facts. Yeah, but this is why Thomas Kuhn later on, when he developed a little bit later in the 70s, the paradigm shift and all that, of course, he was a historian of science, actually. He studied physics and all that, but his really thing was to combine this historical pattern, what is happening here, and this is why he came up with his paradigm shift. But the fact is, that was a very good approach. So I took this course, we're only 5 people. That's okay. That was very, very useful course, particularly for my Whitehead studies. Of course, this I could not know ahead of time, although I had Whitehead since I was in high school when I was 17, and I read a little bit Science in the Modern World, and I got angry with myself because I couldn't understand this. You know? I said, there's somebody smarter than I, this is terrible. Young people have this attitude sometimes, no, I'm a genius, how is this possible? Anyway, it's part of growing up. And so my big ambition, and this has nothing with PhDs or anything else, was I want to understand this man. You know? Kept me going. And thereby get a very good education. Because Whitehead forced me to get into the history of science, get into all kinds of other aspects, which I normally may not have done. The second, so the idea is Plato. Obviously, he concentrated when he dealt with Plato, and we know his famous motto, you know, Western philosophy, that's the most famous motto of his. Western philosophy are merely footnotes to Plato, very famous Whitehead Western philosophy. Maybe a little bit overdoing it, but not totally always wrong, whatever. And there he concentrated on the Timaeus, meaning, of course, a very different dialogue, as you know. And in the Timaeus, I wonder, what was he really interested in? Number one, he was interested in Plato's idea of this demiurgos, the demiurgos. Who is and what is demiurgos? No? Of course, if you're a little bit naive, you think, oh, maybe this is some god or something like that. Of course, there you have to read very carefully. And I have to read some of my training classes in Greek helped me a great deal in this. See, what I'm trying to say, when you do research in the long run, you never know what is useful to you, what you learn on the way. So when you think some abstruse stuff that you learn, suddenly you realize, hey, this is very useful, I can use that. Anyway, so this demiurgos, what is it? The demiurgos is very clearly not a creator god. Clearly not. The demiurgos is, if you use nice American English, a manager of the universe, kind of. He's an architect, he's an engineer. He handles the material, you know, the geometrical forms and all this. You know? But he is not the creator. He's not saying, oh, I do this and this and here's the world. No way. You know? And by the way, as you know, this is one of the reasons why Islam had a problem with philosophy to this day, because they found Plato and Aristotle highly interesting, very useful, but they have a problem. Obviously, Greek philosophy is not into a creator God. So they had to edit it, but they were smart enough to know, hey, wait a minute, okay, but the logic is still pretty good. This is the psychology is good. So, as I always say, one of the reasons of reception of, say, so-called Western philosophy, Plato and Aristotle, obviously has always been this problem with the Semitic religions, you know, Judaism and Christianity and Islam. How do you deal with Greek philosophy, in terms of the deity, meaning these guys, they do not have a creator God. What do you do with that? And out of that, I'm just saying this now, in terms of, we have a whole week to debate on this. Out of this, you have actually what you might call Islamic philosophy, you have a Christian philosophy and Jewish philosophy, meaning Maimonides here in Cairo deals with this. Of course, Ibn Rushd, you know, Islamic philosophy, and later and so forth. And then, of course, so this is an issue. And then the demiurgos, who I characterize as a manager or an engineer or what have you, but clearly he's not a creator God in that sense. That's number one. You find it in the Timaeus. Number two, so I kept this in mind and said, oh, what does he see here? All this. And then suddenly I got my number two candidate, and that was Newton. Now, I found Newton highly interesting only in terms of the history of science, but I spent a whole year reading his letters and all this, and I found it very, very interesting what he has to say. Remember, this was the time without internet, and they wrote person letters, 10, 20 pages, and of course the Royal Society under Henry Oldenburg from Osnabrück, very well known. He was managing everybody and so forth, and so with Newton too, so it was a very, very interesting letter exchange, what have you. And also I always suggest to students, if you want to get some insights into the scientific revolution, sort of, also sociological and all that, it would be wise to check out the letters of the Royal Society, because there in these letters they mix the private with the scientific. Sometimes Newton talks about alchemy. Newton was into alchemy sometimes. He says some abstruse stuff about gold and the stones and then maybe a little bit troubles with the neighbors, whatever. And then he goes about this experimental philosophy and all this. Anyway, but what is much more important in Newton is what kind of deity is he talking about. So when you look at the Principia Mathematica, meaning the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. And here I have to say, this is also an important issue also to convey to the students, that of course philosophy proper was not always called philosophy as such. In Newton's time, philosophy as such was not clearly delineated what philosophy is or what science is. I read you a definition of Newton here quickly. He says here, natural philosophy, philosophia naturalis. And philosophia naturalis means here not precisely philosophy in our understanding or science understanding, meaning there are mix-ups here. It's not so clear-cut. And Newton himself never understood himself as a physicist, he understood himself as a so-called philosopher of natural philosopher. And so he gives a definition: natural philosophy consists in discovering the frame and operations of nature, reducing them as far as may be to general rules and laws, establishing these rules by observations and experiments, and thence deducing the causes and effect of things. That's a good definition. That to him is so-called natural philosophy. Having said this, in those days, of course, again, you had people what they call deists. Now these are people, Royal Society, also Leibniz in Europe and all this. And as you know from history, again, you need the big picture immediately. It was a dangerous enterprise to speak a little bit too loudly about theological matters, meaning this was serious business here, meaning even Newton, although he was well received and a big name, had to be careful. He cannot just say, oh, this is so-and-so and so-and-so, negative. So these guys were careful. The people who started doing experimental science in Amsterdam, Descartes earlier, Spinoza, remember, these were all guys in exile. Amsterdam was the big place for the stock market and for the intellect. And one of the reasons why Amsterdam was avant-garde is there was the money. Yeah, and a certain type of freedom, of course, not compared to our today, but still, John Locke, they were all so-called exiles in Amsterdam, basically. So, and Henry Oldenburg was German by background, so he knew the languages, so he communicated with these guys. So the idea is the Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, had a what you call a general scholium, meaning introductory, prefatory introductory to the whole book. And that, of course, is about 10 pages, highly interesting, deals of course, with the idea of a deity which Newton calls Pantocrator, meaning this Pantocrator again. Yes, it's close to the so-called, closer to a Christian God, but not totally. This is why these people were called deists, meaning they were using a metaphor, but they talked about the book of nature. You know? Instead of being confronted with the idea, what about you? You know, in Goethe you have, what about creation? What is the situation here? And there's no clear-cut answer. Nobody want to expose their real soul. So the deists is the same thing. These guys, of course, had a problem, you know, with the theological matters. So they came up with all kinds of metaphors like the book of nature. So if somebody says, are you a believer? They would say, of course, everybody is a believer. We are reading the book of nature, meaning the creation. Nature as such is like a book, you know, and he's the author, you know? He's the author, and we're the guys who are reading the book, you know, to find out. Of course, that doesn't answer the question, really. You know? So the deists were a little bit sly in these, but they have to be, because some of these church people are not exactly polite sometimes, you know, pressuring some of these people. So the next step is here in Newton, in this general scholium, he introduces what he called Pantocrator. This is a god, yes, as a deity, but the emphasis again here is on ruling, meaning of course it's an analogy to an absolutist kind of rule, but there is really no, you don't get the impression that this so-called ruler with absolute will and all that has something with creation and all that. That's not the issue. He doesn't want to deal with this, you know. It's just that it will satisfy the authorities to do so. And of course, Whitehead was very much familiar with the book of reference. Now comes, you could say, and I do have to spend time on these footnotes stories because they are important. I'm giving you a rough rundown of my research, how I did this, you know, because nobody told me. I mean, I had to find out myself. And here I have to admit, the problem why I was a little bit qualified, I had this education in Germany, but many so-called people at that time, you know, they were into analytic philosophy that just took off, and many of these people had no background in the history of philosophy, particularly many Americans who did this work. You know how things are. In order to find a job, now we get a little bit mundane, but it's also part of life. You have to do something, analytical philosophy. With Whitehead, forget, you couldn't find a job with Whitehead. Nobody was interested, forget about metaphysics, forget about Hegel. Only after Vietnam and the more consciousness and all that, things shifted to Frankfurt and Marx and everything else. But before that, many of them, John Searle is a very typical example, 1950s guy, you know, who went to Oxford and they did, of course, analytical philosophy. The reason is also, it has to be said, most American philosophers, or even English somehow, they knew German very well, but of course, because of the Second World War, not to mention the Holocaust and all this, they were turned off, really turned off. It has something to do with this too, you know, meaning they want to keep their souls white and all this, so they went to England. Oxford, there was also gentlemanly like and all this. So there are sociological reasons why some people moved into analytical philosophy and all that. And, you know, you cannot always swim against the big current sometimes, so you have to compromise. So this is the reason I have a dissertation in analytical ethics. I compromised a little bit here and there, whatever. Now, these are all important considerations. Now, Pantocrator. The interesting part is here, and this becomes very important, what is it? So I had to ask myself, how does this relate to Whitehead? Because I noticed that Whitehead quotes the Principia several times. He mentions Newton very often, cites in the modern world, you know. But then I discovered an excellent source. The letter of exchange between Newton and The doctor who later on, Richard Bentley, Dr. Richard Bentley, who was a bishop, who later on became Dean of Trinity College, Cambridge, a long time. But the letter of exchange between Newton and Richard Bentley is of high importance. And of course, Whitehead read them very carefully. And suddenly I noticed, aha. So I follow, what did he see? Because Bentley was an astute critic of Newton's mechanical universe, mechanical system. You know? And in his letters, I would suggest to you, if you're all interested in these things, read this letter about particularly 5, 6 in this way. This selection is excellent. You know, this selection, we have it in the library here. You will find it, it's a little bit older. I carry it around all the time. Whatever. These are letters of exchange between Dr. Bentley and Newton. And Bentley is asking the right kind of questions. He was a bishop after all. They were a little bit friends, this and that. Of course, Newton had also to be a little bit careful not to let her too out of the window too much. No? So Bentley asked him in his letters to him in question, he says, sir, you know, very beautiful English 17th century and all that. If your mechanical system and your mechanical universe, if you are of the opinion this reveals, I give a rough summary of some of what you find in that, it reveals the glory of God and this and that and so forth, and you say that your system is relatively manageable on this, I would like to ask you to explain miracles to us. Miracles. So, question. If your mechanistic system seems to be working and you say you have a pretty good idea that's the way the universe is operating, how are miracles possible? Do you not see a contradiction between a belief in miracles and your mechanistic universe? Very astute, very simple question. Of course, he was interested in a different story. You know? He wants to hear from Newton, what have you got to say about this? Not about miracles or that. Dr. Bentley is not that ignorant and stupid to think he's dealing with a man who is naive. Of course not. No? And of course, Newton responds, I'm not totally sure. No? And also these questions are very, very relevant. Whitehead read all of this stuff. In the classes around, he can look this through. That's why I followed him. What is going on? But then Dr. Bentley again said, yeah, I mean, take gravitation. You know? And remember, Bentley addressed this to the natural philosopher, not to the physicist. Einstein was a physicist, but Newton was a natural philosopher, by definition. You know? So Bentley asked him, have you got anything to say about gravitation and all this? You know? And Newton was very straightforward, serious, no joking around. This was serious. This is the bishop of the church and all this stuff. He said, the only thing I've done is I calculated bodies in space and time and how they behave. The behavior of bodies in space and time. What gravity is, I do not know. I do not know. Meaning, he says, I have no idea what gravity is all about. I only know somehow it's operating somehow. You see, so he's very careful in his explanation here. Very careful. Okay. Big things a little bit shorter yet, and that is, you now have Plato's Demiurgos, you have Newton's Pantocrator. Very clearly, Whitehead saw his chance. So what he did was, basically, and this is my general thesis, I think I'm not totally wrong on this, he tried to construct here a deity understanding, not necessarily of a Christian creator God, but he needed to change the language. He could not use the traditional language in order to explain this. And And this is where to the back door, his originality comes from, as you know. Now, when you go to the systematics, it's very clear. You have to see it this way. You have to do it this way. Systematically and philosophically, in Whitehead, you have, first of all, this movement from the category of substance to the category of relation. Also, Russell talked about this, relation. And then, of course, he comes up with this idea of process. Meaning, the idea of object-oriented philosophy is nonsense, basically. He says this is totally old-fashioned. In modern science, with mathematical logic and everything, the emphasis has to be relation. It's in the ontological status of relation is upkept. Of course, what Whitehead did is he transferred this into this idea of process, meaning the cosmos and the universe, they're always in perpetual, if you want to use this here as wonderful terminology, perpetual perishing. Although he stole this from John Locke. In John Locke, you have this wonderful term, perpetual perishing. He uses this, and this perpetual perishing, of course, is this idea of process. The other thing is, and I'll see quickly do this, there is a term highly, highly original, and that is called prehension. Prehension. A term you do not find in any English dictionary anywhere. It took some time, so I, as a detective, followed, where did he get this also? Of course, you have the term apprehension, and you chop off the head of apprehension, and you have prehension. The idea is very clear. He felt, by using the term apprehension, this is much too rationalistic, much too Cartesian, and all this. So he felt that real knowledge of things, not objects, of things felt, of things operating on that, operates much more according to a sense of feeling and awareness. So I counted about 52 variations of prehension that he uses. Meaning, Whitehead reintroduces this idea of quote-unquote subjectivity. And subjectivity in his term, of course, is not a four-letter word. Meaning subjectivity in his terms means feeling. Now, when some of the contemporary people talk about feeling that and feeling this, is of course old-fashioned. Whitehead already saw that very clearly. You have to deal with this idea of who are we, and that the idea of feeling as such becomes a very important moment in our understanding of the world. So if you look through this book here, you have about 58 different variations of feeling. Now, feeling, of course, is not just, I feel this cup, and it means also psychological feeling, meaning it's being aware. So the consciousness levels, he never mentions Freud, but I'm pretty sure he knows about Freud. Although the fact is, the consciousness level of feeling varies. So feeling is not just some stupid kind of, oh, I feel it, and this and that, yes, the heart and all that nonsense, Basically, he's much more sophisticated. He said we should look, if we focus on this category of relation, we also should look at this idea of feelings in terms of prehensions. And this is it's very, very interesting to this one. Now, where does he get this term? I come back to our deity in a minute. This is roundabout footnoting. That is, of course, Berkeley, George Berkeley, Bishop Berkeley. And how did I discover this? I follow footnotes. What did I do? I checked exactly what he read on Berkeley. And by chance, I discovered that he misquotes one passage. I wonder, I asked the editors of Process and Reality, the big editors, it never occurred to them to check. They still left the information wrong here, even in the new editions. They added one. This may be pedantic, but strategically, in terms of scholarship, becomes important. Meaning, I noticed that he misquotes Berkeley. What is the result? Very simply, I caught the passages that was significant. You would otherwise miss because he doesn't quote this passage. this is exactly where this idea of prehensive unity appears, where this term for the first time, this prehension appears in terms of Berkeley. Because Berkeley gave him a hint, meaning, this whole idea about perception, far and near, this and that and so forth. And of course what he does is, same way with John Locke, he transforms John Locke and Berkeley into metaphysicians, actually, in a kind of way, and not purely classical empiricists. So Whitehead manipulates his people sometimes. This is why he's not a professional historian of philosophy. He can afford this. He said, oh, this is very useful, this is useful, why do you get it? So this prehension issue becomes a very, very powerful category of understanding. Now, because time is ticking, we are limited in life, whatever, and the idea is very clear. That is, what has this got to do with his deity? Well, it's very simple. Whitehead suddenly sees possibilities, and he introduces, and I have a quote here quickly here, he introduces, and at the end, basically, it's only 15 pages, consider this book huge, but suddenly he talks about his God. There must have been an idea he had a long time, but he just added to it. The final interpretation concept. He says here, his concept of deity, he says, and I quote him, page 345, he says, the nature of God is dipolar, he says. He has a primordial nature and a consequent nature. This is very strange stuff. This is absurd language. However, the consequent nature, he explains, of God is conscious. And it is the realization of the actual world in the unity of his nature. Talk about difficulties, but very subtle, very subtle. He still does not talk about a creator God here, really. But notice when you carefully read this, you hear Newton and you hear Plato a little bit here and there. And I continue, and through the transformation of his wisdom. There he's a little bit middle-class Victorian. Transformation of wisdom, stuff like that. Not finished? Primordial nature is conceptual. What he means by that is the organizational. You have to read a little bit. This means there's an organizational matter, exactly what the so-called Plato's demiurgos is the manager, is the architect. Primordial nature is concept, and the consequent nature is the weaving of God's physical feelings upon his primordial concepts. Right. So when I read this, I said, wow, this is very something. So I had to find a dictionary, this and that. So I need a whole day to figure out this passage, what it means. And slowly, step by step, when I started then retracing 5 years, suddenly it became obvious to me that this concept of Plato, I mean the demiurgos, and certainly the Pantocrator of Newton, is involved in this whole passage. Now we probably need another 2 hours, but you better not. What I basically want to do is to give you hints as to how you can interact, say, systematic philosophy with the history of philosophy, and that the history of philosophy is not some choreography of the beautiful skies and ideas and all that, but if you take it serious, the idea is people don't philosophize just in the vacuum. Even analytical philosophers don't do that. I have met, by chance, many of them in person, talked to them. They had their classical education, I assure you this, and they saw immediately what was useful to them. So I'm saying that I quit here, whatever, I say the following. I think Whitehead's deity concept is very highly original. There are some people who don't like it. There are some people who do process theology. They don't like this at all. They don't like my interpretation, all that. But as far as I know, this is the only book, and I did this, I mean, really paper that shows very clearly there's a very subtle interplay between Whitehead, the logician, Whitehead, the scientist, the mathematician, and Whitehead, the so-called, how should I say, cosmopolitan, educated, Victorian middle-class guy, and he understood the value, of course, of Newton very well, and certainly Plato, and comes up with this. And from what I know, there are some people I know, the first generation of Whiteheadians, Ivan Leclerc, late Victor Lowe, I knew them all personally, and they at least agreed to some extent. What I had to say on this is not totally abstruse, but this was never so-called pronounced publicly in such a way because it's a little bit controversial. The people want me to say things that I don't want to say, because it makes it very easy to attack my interpretation if I say it, but I will not say it. That's why I present this a little bit in terms of scholarship, history of philosophy, and all that. This is not totally abstruse as I presented this, and I have a pretty good sense that if you do Whitehead for a long time, I do not idealize this man. I think he was very old-fashioned in many ways. He never wrote ethics, he never wrote aesthetics. Why? He didn't need to, because within his cosmology you find ethics, In that sense, he follows Plato, basically. His last Victor Lowe, his first steps in Harvard, said his last lecture was mathematics of the good. I mean, here we find Plato again. Anyway, so I better thank you very much for spending your time with me, and I better quit while I'm ahead. And so perhaps you have a few questions, that might be useful. We can say thank you very much. Thank you.